Hey team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. Myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is the Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And I know you've probably heard quite enough of me today. I've done quite a bit of content. Here's me banging on even more for your delectation. So we're going to talk, first of all, actually, we're going to do a correction first, and then we're going to go on and talk about a number of connected topics. First thing is correcting what I said earlier, and I did this in my news piece this morning. I shared this with you. And refurbishing, I don't know whether there's still some more of those. Now, this is worrying. This is John Kirby saying, the Pentagon spokesman saying this.
Ukraine funding, we're coming near to the end of the rope. I mean, today we announced $200 million, and we'll keep that aid going as long as we can, but it's not going to be indefinite. So are we moving with a sense of alacrity? Absolutely. I couldn't give you a date certain on the calendar.
So he's saying we're coming to the end of the rope of Ukraine funding. This is of all the things I've said over the last few weeks, that's maybe one of the most significant, and it almost got through my radar there. This is barely a week after the US and world leaders pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Okay, so I said that this seems to be a bit of an issue to quite contradictory claims from sort of Kirby and the Biden administration. Many people pointed out that we're getting to the end of the rope quote was in the context of the present annual budgeting. So actually, it's not like going forward we're running out and we're not going to be able to continue supporting Ukraine, but just right now in a budgetary sort of scenario, yeah, it's not looking great unless, of course, Congress comes together and so on and so forth. So yeah, I want to correct myself. I may well have been wrong there, and actually he's not going off piste with what he was saying, arguably. And this is what happens when you take videos out of context, where you've just got a quote devoid of any of the stuff around it, and that is my bad. I should have been onto that more. So thank you for those who corrected me. I hope that is indeed the scenario. Right, here we have a little way of baiting you into to think it's talking about something, but it's talking about something else. So with regard to the horrors in Israel or in around Gaza Strip with Hamas and what they did. So the last capitalist here says, terrorists captured the village and executed 17 civilians. The remaining 350 residents of the village were imprisoned by the terrorists in the basement of the local school. Among the prisoners were 77 children and 5 infants. The prisoners were kept for 17 days in a cold basement. They were fed once a day because of the cramped conditions. It was possible to sleep while sitting, only possible to sleep while sitting. 10 people died in the basement because of the terrible conditions. Terrorists set up their headquarters above the basement. Thus, the people in the basement were held as a human shield. The military could not carry out an artillery attack on the terrorist headquarters because then the hostages would die. On the 17th day of the concentration camp, the military broke into the school and released the hostages. You may think this is a story of Hamas terrorists. It is quite possible that this could happen near the Gaza Strip, but it happened in Ukraine, near the border with Russia more than a year ago. Russians are terrorists using human shields. Hamas are terrorists using human shields. No sympathy for terrorists. You can read details about the concentration camp in the village of Yehidny at the link in the comment. And actually, this refers to a very interesting Time article. I will put the link to this in the description below. Inside the basement, where an entire Ukrainian village spent a harrowing month in captivity. This is a pretty horrific story. It's not untypical of many experiences of Ukrainians throughout the war, and so this isn't a competition of who can have the more terrible war or who can have the more terrible experiences in a conflict, right? Not interested in that at all. But don't forget that, and I'm sure you guys won't. But you're just talking to the wider world. It's as if Israel-Palestine issues have suddenly hit the mark and they've like, oh my goodness, this is true human debauchery and horrific war crime, and etc. And actually that kind of stuff has been going on in Ukraine for a year and a half, with Vucic, with Irpin, with here in Yehidny, with there. The experiences of the Ukrainians in places have been absolutely horrific. Now, this is a really good article by Svetlana Ozlovska. Now, this is with the Reckoning Project. It's interesting seeing this at the end. I actually dipped into the interview on Ukraine the Latest, where two people from the Reckoning Project were on. These are journalists who are they are getting trained up to not only do journalism around Ukraine, but actually painstakingly gather information and do interviews in non-leading question ways, really objective interviews to gather as much evidence that can be used in a court of law to hold the Russians to account for the war crimes they've committed. So the Reckoning Project is an absolutely super organization by the sounds of it, and that interview on Ukraine the Latest was really good and a great insight to some of the staggeringly good work people are doing, well, not just in Ukraine, around the world, for the good and right reasons, and they are doing a tremendous job in Ukraine. But anyway, that article on what these people experienced over that time, the conditions they were in, and the horrors of Russian captivity is just when you look at the sheer numbers of people that have perished in this war in the hundreds of thousands, and again, it's not trying to be a competition, but as terrible as the Israel conflict is, it's easy to divert attention fully from one to the other, and think that this new one is so horrific and it's absolutely terrible, and so many people are dying. But actually, it is. And it can only be relatively small unless it spreads. You've got Gaza, you've got Palestine, and you've got Israel. But the whole of Ukraine and the 44 million people and all of those refugees and et cetera, it's just don't forget how important Ukraine is and how terrible things have been for them as well. It's not either or, it's both and unfortunately it's both and in horrors and atrocities. Speaking of horrors, so we're moving on to Anton Gerashchenko here, talking about or showing a video. I meant to show this like weeks ago actually when it came out. Pavlov Gubarev, terrorist Russian army soldier, Ukrainian collaborator with Russia, separatist, political and public figure, and the so-called DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, who participated in pro-Russian protests in Ukraine in 2014. He openly calls for genocide. So he is a prominent Russian figure. I'm going to talk you through what he says here with reading out the subtitles here. So I know a lot of you don't watch, but you listen. So this is what he says, and it's pretty much a false dichotomy, which he presents two options as if those are the only two options, and then he asserts that these are the two outcomes of those two options. And of course, all of this is just mere assertion. But he says, we do not have a lot of choice. We can either win or lose. There can be a tactical peace agreement, but to replace this situation when, in fact, we have entered a conflict of annihilation, that is, either we kill them or they kill us. They added a quote of mine to Wikipedia where I say that we will win anyway. We will destroy 1 million, 2, 3, 5 million Ukrainians. We will destroy them, but we will win. And they made a big deal of a quote. And it's not due to my bloodthirstiness. It's just, a fact. We have to either win or lose. To lose is the decolonization of Russia, dismemberment and looting tenfold, impoverishment of the population, extinction of its indigenous population, its replacement by various ethnic migrant groups, and the liberation of the planet from the Russian people. I mean, goodness me, that's not what would happen if they lose at all. So, I mean, it's pure nonsense. Anyway, he says, to finish, that's what I call it. This is a task. Yeah, anyway. That's the kind of genocidal rhetoric that we see from so many people within the Russian sphere of influence. I'm going to keep the link to Donetsk there, and then we'll move on to something else. But this is a great comment by Ali Mack. So I really appreciate this. I love so many of the comments on the channel. I really do appreciate you guys. So you'd think that at the start of this war, Donetsk city would be the first thing that the Russians would want to secure, as the liberation of the Donbass was one of the main goals. The fact that 20 months later and the Ukrainians are still 2 kilometers away is just embarrassing for the so-called second army in the world. It also shows that the stated goals of this whole war were complete BS. I can't tell you how on point this comment is. It's something I haven't really thought about as explicitly at that, but it's absolutely right. So one of the whole reasons they went to war. I mean, I've told you what the real reason they went to war. The real reason they went to war is Sevastopol, a warm water deep sea port, right? That's the reason they went to war, and all the influence and power that can bring with it. Okay. What they stated as well was, we want the Donbass and denazification of Ukraine, all these other things, right? If they were serious about the Donbass, truly serious about the Donbass, they would have seen that this salient here, this pocket of Ukrainian control right next to Donetsk city, that has allowed Ukraine to be able to shell Donetsk city throughout this war. You would have thought that would have been one of the primary goals. In fact, it's arguably far more important for a lot of reasons, strategic reasons, or operational reasons. Well, strategic reasons, that's more important than Bakhmut, and yet they went for Bakhmut. It became this kind of whole PR thing. But realistically, like, if you were serious about those goals, Avdiivka here would have gone. Would have been an incredibly important kind of primary goal for the Russians. But it's still there 2 years or 1.5 years later. What does that tell you? It tells you that, as he says, as Al-Muk says, that those goals were complete BS. Absolutely. They weren't really serious about it. And or if it was a primary goal, then they ain't what they're cracked up to be, because 1.5 years later, they are still where they were pretty much as they started this war, give or take. So, really on point comment there. Agree with that. I want to now take a bit of a sidestep away from, say, for example, Donetsk and talking about Avdiivka there. And I want to go back to talk of Russian influence, something that I've talked about a lot previously in terms of disinformation, in terms of hybrid warfare, fifth generation warfare, the battle over people's hearts and minds. Russia, as we know, are really good at meddling in elections. They appear to have sown a lot of disinformation in the Slovakian elections recently, and we've now seen the Smer centre-left populist government under Robert Fico, or party under Robert Fico, go into coalition and into government with another leftist party, but also, interestingly, the far rightist party, the most far right party, I think, pretty much in Slovakia, which is a really pro-Russian party. And so what appears to be driving Robert Fico arguably isn't so, or maybe it's just who would go into power with him. Maybe it's his only option. I don't know enough here, but it could well be that the characteristics of being pro-Russian, as Fico appears to be as well, are more important than kind of classic left-right ideological alignment. That's worrying. You've got meddling in all sorts of elections, either through kind of disinformation campaigns on social media, or, say, funding Marine Le Pen in France, and the funding, effectively, therefore, the funding of the far right party in France. That kind of thing going on throughout Europe, really stoking the far right. Germany's AfD have just won a bunch of elections. They are much more pro-Putin, pro-Russia than other parties. There's a lot of connection between Russia and the AfD. We have seen the same in other countries. Hungary's Fidesz, which is a populist right party, has a lot of connections to Russia, a lot of money going from Russia to Hungary. Hungary's democratically backslid throughout the last few years, since Fidesz have been in power for sure. Poland arguably is democratically backslid as well, and they have a rightist party, but their historical context is very different from many other countries, and they really don't like Russia, so they are very much more in support of Ukraine. But if you start coming down into the Balkans, and this is where we're going to go to now, we can see that the influence of Russia on some of these nations is quite significant, particularly Serbia. Now, Serbia is not a country in the EU. They want accession to the EU. However, they've got a President Vucic in charge at the moment who appears to be very much, or at least from a kind of European centrist positioning or objective positioning, Vucic appears to be pretty pro Kremlin or pro Putin, although he'll be saying that as a different kind of situation. Well, Ukraine, the latest, have done a really good segment on this in one of their recent podcasts, and we're going to join that now. So this is Dr. Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and she looks here, or she expresses the worrying poking of the hornet's nest that Russia are doing in places like Serbia, in the Balkans, but particularly Serbia here, where, you know, they are fomenting discord and funding and, you know, motivating activity within far-right movements. So I just let her say what she has to say here.
Difference would it make if he wasn't there? Would Putin still have as much of an opportunity to influence the region with other Serbian politicians?
Absolutely.
So this is Vucic, the chap I was just mentioning.
Thank you, Dom, for your question. So first thing, you asked me a question prior to 2022, which was a very different situation also in Serbia, because Vucic, as soon as he came to power, he realized that if he wants to stay for as long as possible, because his ultimate goal is indeed to retain a power. And in my view, he perceives himself as someone who can replace the persona of Josip Broz Tito from the former Yugoslavia. So his goal has always been really to balance between East and West, and then to escalate the crisis, and then to de-escalate, and then to position himself as a source of stability. And that's something that has really worked. He literally has been playing the West like a fiddle, because they thought if they give Vucic whatever he wants, and if he's the source of stability, there won't be any problems in the Balkans. But let me tell you another thing, which is as soon as Vucic came to power, he did exactly what Putin did at the early age of his political career, which was he destroyed true opposition. He has been investing tremendous resources in the far-right groups. So basically, without a democratic opposition and without pro-Western opposition, he is the one who can only serve for the West as a moderate leader in the eyes of the West, which is absolutely not accurate. And we saw with his latest statements and interviews and how he perceives this crisis, this is his true face. And you asked me also the question about Russian influence in terms of different groups. So Russia has truly been investing tremendous resources in the far-right groups, not only in Serbia, but also in Bosnia and Montenegro, because those groups, they can always mobilize to challenge any question that they want to challenge, whether it's the question of religion, because Russia has been perfectly using, with the help of Serbia, the Serbian Orthodox Church to further polarize the society, especially, for example, in Montenegro. In Serbia, the problem is also that the far-right groups have not been certainly happy with the foreign policy of Serbia. As someone who grew up in Serbia, I've never seen so much nationalism in my life. Basically, right now, the nationalism, especially among the youngsters, is very concerning, because one thing that Serbia and Russia understood very well is that they also need to gather those young group of people to boost the nationalism, to have the people who will support their foreign policy objectives. And let's not forget ideology. I understand oftentimes when I speak with Western analysts, it's all about cost-benefit analysis. It's all about rational analysis about why would Vucic even go to a war, because all he cares about is to remain in power and get as much money as possible. I disagree with that, because as any student of the Balkan history, no, ideology really matters. The way that we study history, the way that we process information through emotions. What I like to say, one of the key words in the Balkans is spite. basically called INET, because while you have the concept of the Russian world, in Russia, you also have the concept of the Serbian world, which was indeed endorsed by the current director of intelligence agency in Serbia, who has very close ties to Russia. Let's also not forget that he also went to Moscow to basically seek the package of the regime preservation when both Russia and Serbia agreed to fight together color revolutions, which really tells you all you need to know how Serbia is trying to isolate itself, etc. And now, my last point, Dom, to your question is, you will often hear President Vucic talking about the European Union, but if you carefully read his statements, he does not discuss the European Union membership. He discusses the European Union path. Why? Because for his political survival, he also needs Western investments and Western support. So what a better way really is to be on the European Union path for decades and to receive all those funds that can help his political survival in the country. And as a matter of fact, Vucic is a very smart guy. He understands so well what will resonate with the West. So he has been selling this whole concept of if you have Serbian economy, everything will be fantastic. He understood that's something that resonates with the West. And this is precisely why you had numerous economic initiatives coming from the West thinking that they can solve the crisis in the region. When I make a parallels to the early 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, everyone thought that by promoting free market and democracy, there is no way that we will have another conflict in Europe. And as a matter of fact, it was just another proof that neither economy nor appeasement actually work. And I'm afraid in 2023, we are making the same mistake. Whether this will escalate to the level of the conflict in the 90s, nobody can tell you. But I'm very confident to say that this, what we saw last week, will not end there. As a matter of fact, I do believe that more escalations are on the horizon.
Well, thank you very much for that. Just one final question.
So, I mean, this is, not looking good for this whole region. As she was saying, there's this far-right ultra-nationalism that's being fomented, being inspired, being supported, being funded by Russia. It's kind of their foreign policy doctrine, isn't it, to just try and sow discord where they can. And it's really important to understand this in terms of the EU. So the EU is a free market trade bloc. Like, essentially the four pillars of the EU, free movement of people, services, capital, and whatnot. This is about the free market. I've said this before, people misunderstand the EU and they think it's some rule-making, bureaucratic, moralistic thing, right? And to some degree it is, but that's the contradiction. In a very real sense, it is a neoliberal economic trade bloc. Right, you got free. It's like one big country inside, but not from any kind of idealistic point of view outside of economic idealism. Here, there's an ideology, or an economic ideology, which you can see reflected in real neoliberal economic proponents. Now, I'm actually not for that. I'm a moderate, a bit of a centrist when it comes to economics, and I like sensible regulation in order to strategically plan, and you use the free market and government in tandem to achieve the best results. Classic sort of mixed economy approach. But the EU is that, but it's also like it tries to be moral as well and do the right things in terms of the environment, in terms of working legislation, all these kind of things. So the people who argue, it's just this kind of left-wing rule-making, centralized leftist project, you just don't get it. But then the leftists that think it's this neoliberal economic enterprise also don't get it, because actually it's just a mix. It's just a big fat walking contradiction, and therein lies possibly some of the issues. Now, when my opinion, when the UK was going for Brexit, I was like, you need to, in order to solve global issues, you need global solutions, and you're more likely to get global solutions when you're working together with other countries, and that will in the end benefit yourself rather than going on the outside, having to renegotiate all these trade deals, having to, economically, it was economic suicide was the first thing. My opinion, and lots of people hate me for this who are really pro Brexit in my viewership, but vote leave or Brexit would never ever win the economic vote. It's just, you can't. I mean, I publicly debated this several times in Bournemouth, actually, and it was pretty clear to me that, and it still is exceptionally clear, that you don't win the economic vote. You don't opt yourself out one of the biggest trade blocs in the world and have to renegotiate every single one of those trade deals from a position of a lack of power. So the EU is a massive trade bloc and an organisation. It goes around and it negotiates really good deals for the EU because they're in the power position. You opt out that and you negotiate the deal yourself. So we come out that, do a deal with Australia and New Zealand, and we get screwed over. Like a notoriously bad deal where agriculturally we're screwed over compared to the deal we had, within the EU and Japan and all these. We've now got even our own negotiators who are involved in that saying it was just a raw deal. Like, you aren't going to win the economic argument. You can win the immigration argument, and that's why I say it's one of the main reasons Brexit happened. And if you find that a really important argument, then you can put all your store in that. But to go back to Brexit, I remember when my dad, who's a staunch Brexiteer, I was arguing with him, and I was saying to him, look, one thing that's worth bearing in mind, Dad, is that you need to wonder who is supporting us in Brexit around the world outside of the EU. None of the EU want us to leave for obvious reasons. Trump wants us to leave, but that's a whole different kettle of fish. That's an interesting one, and I think that's a case of being able to get, in order to weaken possibly the EU a little bit in terms of US EU trade, and lots of interesting reasons why Trump might have gone for that. But the one I was talking to my dad about most was Putin. Why does Putin want the UK out of the EU? He wants us out of the EU in order to weaken the EU. Why does he want to weaken the EU? Because that benefits him. A weak EU is less able to stand up to Russia and Putin. One of his raisons d'etre for the last decade has been trying to screw over the EU. It is, as he sees it, a zero-sum game. Because the EU is one of the, partially because it's so geographically local to Russia in terms of, in comparison to the US, but also just because of its size and of its power. It is one of the most robust organizations that can and does stand up to Russia. Now, you can argue that under Merkel it didn't do that enough, etc., and there's too much appeasement. Yes. But it has the ability to hold Russia to account. Now, if you start screwing with that, Russia is able to do what it likes. It can then do deals with countries unilaterally where it's in a power position with its hydrocarbons rather than having to deal with a massive trade bloc, so on and so forth. It is massively in Russia's best interest to see the EU break up, right? So when you start seeing their influence in the East, in Hungary being an absolute thorn in the side of the EU, supported by Russia, you understand, you understand where that Russian influence is coming from and why. When you look at Serbia, who's trying to accede to the EU, has she was talking about Vucic having a pathway into the EU, and you've got Russia getting involved to sow ultra-nationalism, which is anti-EU. It's like, no, we don't need this we're greater together idea. It's ultra-nationalism is all about Serbia. And the same with Bosnia-Herzegovina or Herzegovina, Montenegro, and all these Balkan countries. The stoking of the ultra-nationalist fires by Russia has the intention of dividing Europe, of keeping these countries away from the pull of the EU. EU, and they'll be sowing the reason why they were funding Marine Le Pen's political party in France is because of their Eurosceptic stance. So it's all the Eurosceptic parties, the AfD in Germany. That's clearly the kind of politics, that Euroscepticism, that Russia, that Putin would really like to see take hold right throughout Europe. And that's what worries me most. I speak to a lot of people who are Leave voters and Brexiteers in the UK, and they see it all about the UK and us taking back sovereignty and political power. I would contest all of these, right? But I don't want to sidetrack this. But I look at it from the other way. It's like, what does it lose in sense of the whole world, in the global stability, regional stability? Let's not, as a British person, I like to look beyond our borders, which is, okay, let's stop thinking about whether it benefits the UK or not. Let's think about who else it benefits or doesn't benefit outside of our borders. And us leaving the EU benefits nefarious actors around the world. It benefits the power structures that I worry about. It benefits Russia and the Kremlin. And Putin knows that, laughing all the way to his palace on the Black Sea when that 2016 vote came through. Absolutely what he wanted. And that worries me. And that's what I told my dad, water off a duck's back. But, there you go. So I know some of you, pro-Brexit voters and sympathizers out there are going to be dead against me. But you have to understand the geopolitical game of chess that's going on here. And what's taking place in the Balkans and throughout the rest of the Europe. And I worry about the rise of the far right in Europe, because with the rise of the far right is the rise of ultranationalism. And with that is the rise of Euroscepticism. And with that is a destabilization of the whole region. Honestly, this is big stuff. If Europe falls apart and goes into each individual nation state, then all the good and all the good that can be done by the EU and the power of working together towards a moral and decent future, I think is all undone. And in this zero-sum game here, I think that's a Russian gain and a BRICS gain. So I think it's absolutely crucial, and I think the US knows this. The US knows this. It's crucial that the EU maintains its integrity and its strength. In the face of these challenges. Anyway, that's my tuppence. Please feel free to disagree with me. I'm sure you will. But bring some good arguments, please. Right, okay. For the very final thing, I'm going to show you what I think is just pure insanity here. Let's have a look at this. I will forgive you for ducking when you saw that coming over. I mean, there's low passes and there's low passes. I would have been facing the mud there, thinking I'm going to get a wheel in my spam. I've got a big enough forehead. It's a big enough target. Thank you very much. I need it down when that bad boy's coming past. Anyway, that's enough nonsense from me. Thank you so much for all of your support. Sorry this one's a bit late out tonight. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care. Speak to you soon.